learned. What she didn't know? Jasmine had spent 11 months crafting a groundbreaking housing proposal built on hard data and real families' voices. When Jasmine released it, she didn't destroy Karoline. She made her irrelevant. So the question is, what exactly did Jasmine Crockett do that made Congress and the country finally listen? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the blazing lights of a Capitol Hill studio, the countdown hit 0. "We're live," a voice crackled in the control room. Millions were watching. The segment was called "The Federal Fight: Who's Failing the Homeless?" A primetime debate on post-pandemic housing policy. At center stage sat two women, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, eyes calm, suit crisp, presence steady, and across from her, Karoline Leavitt, younger, smirking, perfectly rehearsed. The moderator barely finished her opening line before Karoline leaned forward, seizing the first strike like a predator spotting weakness. "Let's just be real for a second," Karoline said, voice sweet but blade sharp underneath. "Congresswoman Crockett seems to think poverty is just a budget problem, that if we hand out enough checks, the crisis disappears." She smiled, not at Jasmine, but at the viewers. "It's like trying to fix a broken roof by throwing money at the rain. Honestly, if that's your solution," she added, eyes locked in, "maybe it's time you brushed up on some basic economics." There was a beat, just one, but it echoed like thunder in the silence that followed. The moderator's eyes flicked to Jasmine, nervous now, sensing the storm. Somewhere off camera, a producer mouthed, "Oh God," but Jasmine didn't blink. No eye roll, no smirk. She didn't adjust her mic. She didn't even sit forward. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady and direct. "I don't need to relearn theory, Miss Leavitt," she said, soft, but without an inch of weakness. "I spend most days talking to people who live what textbooks leave out." Another pause, and then, "I fix what theory forgot." The sentence landed like a scalpel, precise, bloodless, devastating. Not a clap, not a cough. The audience froze, caught between shame and awe. Karoline blinked, lips parting as if to retort, but no words came. Even the moderator hesitated before speaking again, thrown by the shifting gravity. In less than 10 seconds, the momentum had shifted, and no one watching could quite explain how. The camera zoomed in on Jasmine. No anger, no smugness. Just that look, like someone who had seen the fire, walked through it, and now watched others pretend they knew heat. Behind the scenes, Twitter lit up. Producers scrambled for new graphics. Studio staff exchanged glances. But on stage, it was war in slow motion. Karoline had come armed with zingers and applause lines. Jasmine had brought something else, something quieter, deadlier. She was playing a different game, a longer one, and the entire room could feel it. The studio lights faded, but Jasmine didn't need a stage to keep fighting. The real work didn't happen in sound bites. It happened in silence, behind closed doors, when no one was watching. She walked out of the building without a single word to the cameras, her heels tapping sharp against the marble, echoing like gunshots in the empty corridor. Staffers rushed behind her, heads bowed to phones, tweets flying like shrapnel from the fire Karoline had lit. But Jasmine wasn't interested in fighting fire with fire. She stepped into the black sedan waiting outside, tossed her blazer in the seat next to her, and closed the door like closing a vault. The ride back to the hotel was silent. She didn't speak, didn't scroll. Her aide Liana glanced over once, but thought better of saying anything. Jasmine stared out the window, face unreadable, but eyes calculating, not angry, just focused, like someone who'd taken a punch and already knew how to end the fight without swinging back. By the time they reached the hotel, the sky had darkened. Reporters were still buzzing outside, flashing lights bouncing off the tinted glass like sparks off steel. Jasmine ignored them. No hand wave, no comment. She moved quickly through the side entrance, past the concierge who nodded respectfully, but wisely said nothing. Inside her room, the air was still, the furniture untouched since morning. She dropped her bag, kicked off her shoes, and sat at the desk. The hum of the mini fridge, the faint creak of the air vent, those were the only sounds. Then she opened her laptop. The The screen came alive instantly. Not social media, not news alerts. Just one file blinking at her like an unfinished weapon. Federal Housing Equity Reform Draft V22. She started typing. Edits. Revisions. Notes from the last listening tour in Mississippi. Quotes from a single mother in Detroit who worked 2 jobs but still lived in a car with her 2 sons. A statistic about 43,000 veterans waiting on housing vouchers. Line by line, she rebuilt what the system had broken. Her fingers moved fast, steady, relentless. This wasn't a clapback. This was a blueprint, a rebuttal that didn't need to shout to be heard. She didn't write to impress Karoline. She wrote to bury her in facts. Liana knocked softly and stepped in, holding a sandwich she knew Jasmine wouldn't eat. "They're already clipping the debate," she said, setting it down. "Karoline's trending. Again." Jasmine didn't look up. Her voice came low and even. "Let her." Liana paused. "You're not going to respond? Not even one post?" Jasmine stopped typing just long enough to breathe in slowly. Then she said, "Everyone thinks I'm silent because I lost." Her fingers hovered over the keys. "But I'm building something they don't even have the tools to measure yet." She leaned back, eyes tired but alive, shoulders firm. "They want sound bites. I'm giving them structure." Liana nodded but didn't reply. She'd seen this before. Jasmine wasn't retreating. She was loading. Every hour Karoline spent celebrating was another page added to something far more dangerous than a headline. A fully formed policy plan grounded in data, testimony, and unshakable truth. The kind of thing that didn't trend, but stuck. The kind of thing that couldn't be spun because it came from the mouths of people the system forgot. Jasmine knew what Karoline didn't. The public could be distracted, but not forever. And when the noise died down, all that would be left was the work. At exactly 5:03 a.m., the hotel room was quiet in that fragile way rooms feel before something historic happens. Outside, Providence was still dark. Barely a car on the streets, just the occasional flicker of a traffic light changing for no one. Inside, Jasmine Crockett sat barefoot at the desk, wrapped in a plain gray sweatshirt, a legal pad full of scribbled notes beside her, a lukewarm cup of tea untouched on the nightstand. Her laptop cast a faint glow across her face, but it wasn't the light of distraction. It was the light of decision. The file sat on the screen, open but still unsent. Federal Housing Equity Reform Act, Draft V22. The title was clinical. The contents were not. Every paragraph, every bullet point had been carved from 11 months of field visits, late-night calls, folded testimonies from single mothers and caseworkers, policy memos she'd rewritten herself when staffers said it was too ambitious. There were no talking points here, no quotes engineered for applause, just raw evidence, and the quiet fury of someone who had seen too much suffering explained away by people in suits. She scrolled one last time, not because she was unsure, but because she knew this wasn't just a document. It was a mirror, one that would force Congress, media, and bureaucrats to look directly at what they'd chosen to ignore. Charts laid bare where the money had gone and where it hadn't. Receipts showed the gap between what was promised and what was delivered. There were names, dates, cities. A mother in Cleveland who waited 14 months for a voucher while city council members voted to expand a baseball stadium. A veteran in Dallas who died on a shelter waiting list while 3 departments blamed each other. None of this was abstract. This wasn't policy, it was people. And Jasmine had made sure every one of them was heard. She added no headline, no bold font, no dramatic closing. But at the very end, on its own line, she left one sentence, not italicized, not underlined, just sitting there like a blade. You've had the money, you've had the mandate. What you haven't had is the will. She sat back in her chair, arms heavy, fingers stiff from typing straight through the night. Her eyes were red, not from crying, but from staying open too long. She didn't stretch. She didn't exhale. She just looked at the screen, then to the clock. 5:03 a.m. With a slow, steady hand, she opened the email draft she had built in silence. No speech, no press release, no grand opening line, Only a list of names, carefully chosen, handpicked, some of whom had never returned her calls before. Key policy staffers, editors at 3 major papers, senior aides in both parties, directors at urban housing institutes who'd once said she was too emotional to talk data. She included them all. Every name on that list had, at one point or another, helped stall, soften, or bury real reform. The subject line was left blank. The attachment was titled simply, "The Work They Refused to Do." And then she clicked send. No fireworks, no music, just a quiet digital confirmation. Message sent. 5:03 a.m. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't lean back like a hero in the final act. She just stared at the screen for a moment longer. She knew what she had just done. Not thrown a punch, but dropped an anvil. This wasn't about Karoline Leavitt anymore. This wasn't about a debate or a viral clip. This was a line in the sand. No one could say they didn't know anymore. Not after this. If they ignored it now, they'd have to explain why. She slowly closed the laptop, the sound of the hinge folding down like a book snapping shut. The room was still dark, the sky outside just starting to shift to a dull gray. Jasmine stood, rubbed the stiffness from her shoulder, and walked to the window. There were no crowds, no flashbulbs, just a parking lot, a breeze, and the distant sound of delivery trucks starting their day. But what she had just sent out would move faster than any of them. It was out now. Unstoppable. Unavoidable. Undeniable. And the world wouldn't know it yet, not until it was already too late to ignore. By the time Jasmine finally closed her eyes, the file had already begun its quiet invasion, slipping past gatekeepers, skipping inbox hierarchies, and landing where it was least expected, in the hands of people who could no longer pretend not to know. It started small. A policy analyst at the Philadelphia Inquirer opened the file at 6:47 a.m., intending to skim it. By 7:12, she had forwarded it to the editorial board with a subject line that simply read, "You need to see this now." At 8:03, an assistant producer at Face the Nation printed the last 12 pages and left them on her executive producer's desk, circled in red. By 9 a.m., the document was bouncing between congressional inboxes like a ricochet bullet, first among interns, then senior aides, then chiefs of staff who hadn't even had coffee yet. No one had expected it, and that was the point. While DC obsessed over who won a soundbite war the night before, Jasmine had loaded the truth and fired it without warning. By 10 a.m., the ripple had become a wave. The Washington Post ran a headline that made seasoned strategists sit up straighter. A quiet bill with loud implications. Crockett's plan upends the narrative. The article didn't sensationalize. It didn't need to. It simply laid out what Jasmine had done. No press conference, no grandstanding, no media rollout. Just policy, sent cold, and it was working. Politico followed with a summary breakdown. Vox called it surgical. On Twitter, the hashtag Crockett receipts climbed past trending celebrity gossip and broke into the top 3 by 10:34 a.m. Beneath it, screenshots of the PDF were being dissected like classified intelligence. Users highlighted phrases like intentionally defunded pathways and budgeted neglect. Some posted their own housing horror stories, tagging their representatives. The silence Jasmine had held the night before was now being filled by the people. Panic settled in Karoline Leavitt's team like fog over cold ground. Her comms director, Seth, burst into her office mid-call, holding a printout. "It's everywhere," he said, not even trying to hide the shake in his voice. Karoline barely looked up. "What? That file?" she scoffed. "It's just another emotional dump. People get worked up, then they move on." But she was wrong, and somewhere deep down, she could feel it. Still, when CNN called requesting a response, she agreed. 15 minutes later, under studio lights, she sat composed, smug again, lips sharpened like she thought they still mattered. "Let's not confuse feelings with function," she said to the anchor. "It's easy to write with emotion. That doesn't make it policy." She paused for effect, waited for the host to nod, but they didn't. They were already flipping through printed pages of the bill on their lap. And across America, those watching weren't buying the act anymore. The applause line had expired, and the receipts were in. By early afternoon, Washington, D.C. no longer felt like a city of power. It felt like a pressure cooker seconds from blowing. The confirmation from Reuters had struck like lightning. Blunt, cold, irrefutable. The title of the article alone sent tremors through Capitol Hill. Crockett's housing proposal, fully verified, no inaccuracies found. Inside, it was clinical, brutal. Reuters had gone line by line, chart by chart, budget footnote by footnote. Veterans, voucher backlogs, urban-rural funding disparities, case data from 17 states. Every claim Jasmine Crockett had made in her proposal was verified against federal records, internal memos, and state housing reports. Not one correction issued, no overreach, no spin, just reality, raw and defenseless. The article spread across offices like smoke through an old vent system. Hill staffers, journalists, policy analysts, they didn't even forward it. They slacked it, texted it, whispered it in the halls between meetings. You could feel it even in the lobbies of the Senate buildings, where aides leaned over coffee counters, reading the article out loud to each other with eyebrows raised and mouths half open. One Democratic strategist muttered under his breath, "She didn't just come prepared, she came armed." And for the first time in weeks, even those who had ignored Jasmine's emails began wondering if they'd underestimated a woman who never once raised her voice, but had just broken the noise. But that wasn't the worst of it. For Karoline, the collapse was just beginning. At 1:43 p.m., a user on a small policy watchdog forum posted something seemingly innocuous. Wait, didn't Leavitt vote against a housing amendment just like this last year? 10 minutes later, the internet had proof. A digital screenshot of a public record pulled straight from the legislative archives. H.R. 2157, Affordable Housing Access Revision Act, Committee Vote 2023. Leavitt, nay. The same policy framework, the same funding mechanism. In fact, the bill had even shared language Jasmine had expanded in her own draft. Back then, Karoline had dismissed it as overregulation with no fiscal spine. Now she was on national television calling Jasmine's version overly emotional. The contrast wasn't just striking, it was damning. The receipts were now on both sides of the aisle. Within the hour, screenshots of the roll call vote appeared alongside Jasmine's proposal on Twitter, Instagram, and even TikTok. The meme machine activated instantly. One half of the screen showed Karoline mocking Jasmine on live TV. The other half showed her nay vote from last year, stamped in red. Hashtags exploded. Crockett receipts became receipts and roll calls. One user posted, "Jasmine brought the truth. Karoline brought the contradiction." And it was only getting worse. That evening, during a segment on CNN's Crossfire Weekly, longtime analyst Hector Barnes leaned forward in his chair, glasses low on his nose, holding a physical printout of the Reuters article in one hand and Karoline's 2023 vote record in the other. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't grandstand. He just looked directly at the camera and said, "Leavitt lit the match. Crockett ended the fire with facts." The studio fell quiet. Even the conservative panelist, a usual firebrand, offered no rebuttal. The host nodded slowly. The quote hit Twitter in seconds, and within 15 minutes, "End it with facts" trended alongside Jasmine's original tag. Meanwhile, Karoline sat in the green room of a podcast studio in Arlington, surrounded by silence thicker than the makeup caking under the lights. Her phone buzzed on the armrest. It was Seth. Again. Reuters confirmed everything. You need to stop calling it soft. No emoji, no punctuation, just urgency. She read it and said nothing. Her reflection in the makeup mirror looked less like a rising star and more like someone realizing the script she'd rehearsed all week had turned to ash. Her eyes darted to the TV behind her. The Chiron read, "Crockett's plan verified. Leavitt's pass vote resurfaces." She looked down again. The file in her lap felt heavier now. She hadn't even opened it. It was Jasmine's bill, printed out, stapled, annotated by her comms team. She had mocked it on instinct, dismissed it because she assumed it was hollow. But now she could feel it pulsing beneath her fingers like a live wire. There were no talking points that could erase a public record, no charm that could spin math, no smirk that could outmaneuver someone who had stayed silent and let the facts speak. And Jasmine? She still hadn't said a word. Just when Karoline thought the storm might settle, the real explosion hit, not from a rival, but from a careless truth whispered behind closed doors and dragged into daylight. It began with 47 seconds. No intro, no watermark, just a low hum of background chatter, wine glasses clinking, then the unmistakable sharpness of Karoline Leavitt's voice. Clear, confident, and catastrophically reckless. They don't read the bills, that crowd, please. Give them a few slogans, a couple of punchlines, and they're good for the week. There was a pause in the audio. Just laughter. Not the nervous kind. The entitled kind. The kind that only happens when people believe the cameras are off and power is permanent. A man in the background chuckled and said something unintelligible, to which Karoline responded, still laughing. We're out here pretending they care about policy. Most of them can't even fill out a benefits form without help. That was the match. The clip dropped online at 10:08 a.m. the next morning. An anonymous Twitter account with no followers, no bio, just one post. This is what she really thinks of voters. The retweets came in slow at first. Then came the verification from two journalists at ProPublica and Politico. The audio matched her voice. The location, a closed-door donor dinner in Charleston 2 weeks earlier. And by noon, the clip had racked up 3.2 million views and become a five-alarm inferno. Newsrooms scrambled to confirm. The Hill ran the headline, Leavitt's private mockery of voters sparks national backlash. CNN cut into regular programming to play the clip. Twice. On MSNBC, Joy Reid leaned in and said, "This isn't just arrogance. This is contempt with a microphone." Fox News surprisingly didn't defend her. Even they couldn't. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett's name wasn't trending. It didn't have to be. Everyone knew who she was now by comparison, and she hadn't said a single word. Karoline's inner circle went into lockdown. Her press secretary canceled all interviews within 20 minutes. Donors started ghosting before the hour was out. One PAC publicly withdrew a $400,000 commitment, citing a difference in values. 3 more followed. An anonymous aide leaked a screenshot of the campaign Slack thread. "We are bleeding support. Anyone got a lifeboat?" Her political mentor in Connecticut issued a carefully worded statement about the need for respectful tone. Another congressman, one she'd campaigned beside just last month, simply unfollowed her on Twitter and locked his account. The betrayal hadn't come from a scandal dug up by opposition researchers. It had come from her own voice, dripping with the kind of elitist detachment people fear exists in every politician. The kind of voice that confirms the worst suspicions of voters across America. That some of them, the ones in power, don't just disagree with the people, they despise them. By 2 p.m., hashtags like Slogan Queen, They Can't Read, and Mockery Leavitt blanketed social media. Parents posted videos of their kids holding up signs that said, "I may not be a policy expert, but I'm not stupid." Veterans reposted screenshots of Karoline's old campaign ads alongside the audio. One caption read, "Thanks for the slogan. I'll remember it on Election Day." Journalists reached out for comment. Her office released a dry, 3-sentence statement claiming the recording was taken out of context, but no one bought it. The tone was too clear, the intent too naked. Even her campaign manager looked exhausted by sunset. In a leaked voicemail to a donor, he could be heard saying, "She might survive this in one piece, but not in the same seat." And Jasmine? Still no tweet, no press conference, no leaked memo. Just a quiet presence in the background, as the country that Karoline mocked began to turn. At 4:15 p.m., a coalition of local activists, housing advocates, and civic leaders released a letter titled, "We read the bills, we lived them." It was signed by over 300 organizations, many of which had testified for or against housing reforms over the years. The language wasn't inflammatory, it was surgical. It highlighted the contrast between someone who talked policy and someone who had done it, between someone who scoffed at the system and someone who worked through it, slowly, painfully, but with purpose. A national radio host summed it up perfectly on his afternoon segment. Jasmine Crockett didn't have to clap back. America's doing it for her. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, Republican aides began whispering the words no party wants to hear during midterms. She's toxic now. In private meetings, chairs quietly removed Karoline's name from upcoming policy panels. Talk radio, once her safe ground, now featured call-in after call-in from disillusioned listeners. One man's voice cracked as he said, "I voted for her. I believed her. Now I feel like a punchline." It was more than a bad week. It was a collapse. And everyone could see it happening in real time. And still Jasmine remained silent. No fanfare, no gloating. Just the same calm presence that had disarmed Karoline in the studio, that had written policy through the night, that had sent a 71-page bomb into Washington while the rest of the country was still asleep. Because while Karoline mocked the people behind the policies, Jasmine had already done the work. And the work was now speaking louder than either of them ever could. As Karoline's words scorched through the headlines, Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She raised her sleeves. There was no press advisory, no motorcade, no podium with her name printed on a foam coreboard. At 8:42 a.m. the following morning, while cable news anchors still dissected Karoline Leavitt's implosion on a loop, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood outside a temporary shelter on the west end of Bridgeport, Connecticut, wearing a windbreaker, flats, and a name badge that simply read, "Visitor." The air smelled like wet concrete and something metallic. The parking lot was nearly empty. A rusted HVAC unit clicked steadily overhead. She didn't come with handlers or cameras. There was no media rollout. She'd promised to return here weeks ago, long before debates or headlines or hashtags, and today she kept that promise. Inside the shelter, rows of folding chairs lined the cafeteria. A wall-mounted whiteboard listed dinner hours and curfew rules. A little boy with matted hair sat coloring beside a woman who couldn't have been more than 25. Her eyes puffy from lack of sleep, but focused like steel on the intake forms in front of her. That was the real backdrop, not cable news. Jasmine moved quietly, nodding to volunteers, accepting a clipboard from the facility director, and slipping into the flow of their operations. She reviewed case files, noted gaps in funding reports, and walked the halls, pausing at every room that had a door left open. One room had 4 bunk beds and 6 residents. Another had a sign taped to the wall. "Please let staff know if heat stops again." Jasmine read every detail. She asked about meal delivery lags. She asked why 2 applications for state vouchers had been marked return to sender. She didn't record. She didn't take notes for Twitter. She simply listened. The press eventually caught wind, of course. They always do. By mid-morning, a local stringer from the Hartford Times caught sight of her outside by the dumpsters, speaking softly with a maintenance worker about broken lighting along the East Corridor. By noon, a half-dozen reporters had formed a loose knot near the main entrance, murmuring into phones, adjusting camera angles, waiting for a moment, any moment they could frame. Jasmine didn't give them one. When a microphone was finally pushed her way and someone asked, "Congresswoman Crockett, do you have any comment on the Leavitt recording?" She didn't sigh. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't blink. She just looked at the man behind the mic, young, nervous, hoping for a viral soundbite, and said in a tone calm enough to silence wind, "I'm not here to comment. I'm here to rebuild the system she made a joke of." She didn't wait for a follow-up. She turned and walked back inside. Behind her, a silence fell like a curtain. No shouting, no pushback, just a camera that didn't know whether to keep rolling or stop. Inside, the work resumed. She sat with a grandmother named Eloise who had been waiting 7 months for a decision on her housing voucher while sleeping in her daughter's SUV. Jasmine held her hand, not as a politician, but as a woman who understood what silence from a system feels like. She spoke with Jamal, a Navy veteran who'd been promised transitional housing that never came. He showed her a manila folder of paperwork that no one had touched. "I just want someone to read it," he said. Jasmine did. Right there, on the spot. No statements, no posture, just presence. At one point, a staffer offered to clear the room for privacy. Jasmine shook her head. "No need," she said. "This is where policy is supposed to start, from inside rooms like this." Outside, the temperature dropped. A reporter tried to stage a wider shot for the evening news, but Jasmine wouldn't stop moving, wouldn't pause for a headline. She was 5 steps ahead, already asking the shelter manager if the second boiler unit had been inspected this month, already calculating in her head how HUD's emergency allotment had failed to cover staff salaries in winter. Because while Karoline was bleeding donors and scrambling to unsay what had already been burned into public memory, Jasmine Crockett was standing inside the very system Karoline had mocked, touching it, questioning it, and doing the work no one ever saw on C-SPAN. The injustice wasn't just that Karoline had insulted people like Eloise and Jamal. It was that she assumed they'd never fight back. But they didn't have to. Jasmine was already fighting with them, and for them. By 2 p.m., a photo leaked online. Not from her team, not from press, from a caseworker at the shelter. It showed Jasmine sitting on the floor with a child in a coloring book, cross-legged beside a radiator, her congressional pin barely visible against her collar. The caption was just 3 words. She showed up. That image went further than any rebuttal ever could. It wasn't strategic, it wasn't curated, it wasn't perfect. But it was real. And in a week where spin had consumed every inch of air, reality felt like revolution. Later that evening, as Jasmine left through the back entrance to avoid the remaining press, a volunteer called after her, voice trembling, "You're the first official who didn't just shake hands and leave." Jasmine turned, adjusted her coat, and replied quietly, "Because I don't believe in leaving before the story ends." And then she walked into the cold, the noise behind her forgotten, the work ahead waiting. As the noise outside grew louder, inside the walls of the house, something rare was about to happen. Not a scandal, not a soundbite, but real movement. At exactly 10:03 a.m., the chamber air felt heavier than usual, like the ceiling itself was leaning in to listen. Room 216 of the Rayburn House office building, lined with dull oak panels and the faded smell of stale coffee, had rarely carried this much pressure. The Subcommittee on Housing and Community Development was convening for what should have been another procedural vote. Bills debated, amendments rejected, time wasted. But this wasn't procedural anymore, because the last item on the agenda was Jasmine Crockett's bill. The same one that started as a silent rebuttal, the same one that tore through political circles like a fault line. And now, with reporters crammed in the gallery, staffers standing shoulder to shoulder along the back wall, and every seat filled by someone who had suddenly remembered why committee meetings still mattered. It was time to decide. Jasmine sat near the end of the semicircle, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the document in question lying unopened before her. She hadn't spoken yet. Her eyes didn't dart, her posture didn't shift. She was still, like the quiet before a verdict. The chair cleared his throat. "We'll now move to vote on Resolution H.R. 4289, the Crockett Housing Reform Act." No fanfare, no prelude. The clerk began the roll call. Representative Delgado? Aye. Representative Kim? Nay. Representative Vasquez? Aye. Representative Bishop? Nay. The rhythm was cold, mechanical, like the slow turning of a safe dial. Every aye clicked louder than it should. Every nay lingered just long enough to inject doubt. And then came the name that turned heads before it was even spoken. Representative Rourke, a Republican from rural Colorado. Veteran, conservative hardliner. Never once crossed the aisle on housing. Everyone knew that, including him. He shifted, cleared his throat, and then, aye. The room didn't gasp, but it tightened. A subtle stretch of silence. Someone's pen scratched too loud. A staffer looked up like she'd misheard. Then came Representative Hall, an independent from Vermont. Voted like a skeptic. Spoke like a ghost. No one ever counted on him because he never committed to being counted. Aye. Now the silence was thunder. No celebration. Just the room collectively realizing something had just cracked in the wall. The final count, 8 in favor, 5 against. Jasmine's bill had passed committee. No applause followed, just a long, reverent pause. Because for once, in a room built to delay and dilute, a piece of legislation had not only survived, but moved forward. The chair cleared his throat again, this time with the faintest tinge of surprise. House Resolution 4289 will be forwarded to the House floor for consideration. And that was it, a single sentence. But in that room, it felt like history whispering itself into the record. Jasmine stood, slow and measured, smoothing the crease in her blazer. All cameras turned. Microphones floated toward her like moths to quiet flame. She didn't blink. "I didn't write this for airtime," she said, voice low but unmistakable, like concrete underfoot. "I didn't write it for applause or retweets or panels on prime time. I wrote it for people who stopped asking for help years ago because the silence they got back taught them not to try again." A breath passed. A reporter's pen stopped moving. "I did this for the people who've been left behind so often, they don't even bother raising their hands anymore." Another pause. "This bill is for them." Then she walked out. No grin, no victory lap, no raised fists. Just steps that didn't need to be loud to carry weight. In the hallway, her aide Liana was already waiting, eyes wide with the quiet awe of someone watching history refuse to be announced. Only proven. She didn't speak, just nodded once. Jasmine smiled. Not for a camera, not for the press, but for herself. Not because it was over, because it had finally begun. As Jasmine's proposal crossed aisles and won quiet applause in rooms that once ignored her, Karoline found herself drowning in the noise she created. Only now, no one was listening. It began with a silence she didn't expect. Not from the media. They were louder than ever. Not from Jasmine. Her silence was strategic. It came from within. From the people who used to orbit Karoline Leavitt like satellites. Staffers, consultants, donors, interns, all suddenly unreachable. The inbox that once rang with calendar holds and media requests now returned more automated replies than confirmations. Meetings postponed, calls missed, aides out sick. Inside her Capitol Hill office, the lights stayed on, but the energy was gone. Her senior communications director walked out just before 9 a.m., his passkey left on the edge of her desk. No warning, just 2 words scribbled on a Post-it. "Can't spin this." By midday, it felt like a campaign funeral. Her scheduler, a Marine veteran who had followed her since the governor's race, handed in a resignation letter that was just 1 paragraph long. "I came here to serve policy, not recover from PR disasters." The campaign finance director didn't even call. She simply emailed a list of donors who had reconsidered, each one redlined with a single phrase: funding withdrawn. A PAC from Florida, a real estate group from Ohio. The largest one, a Silicon Valley funder who once hosted private dinners in Karoline's honor, returned her donation request with 2 words in the memo: hard pass. That night, desperate to show she was still in control, Karoline walked onto a live set at Capitol Focus tonight. Her heels clicked confidently, her jaw clenched beneath the perfect makeup job. She smiled on cue, sat straight. The lights flared, cameras blinked red, and the anchor didn't waste time. "Congresswoman Leavitt, the recording that surfaced last week has drawn backlash not only from Democrats but also key figures in your own party. Do you stand by what you said?" She blinked, steady but cornered. "I think people misunderstood the context. I was referring to the way messaging gets lost in politics, not the people themselves." Her voice was even. Her hands didn't shake, but her eyes kept drifting. To the floor manager, the teleprompter, the live timer inching forward like a noose. The anchor pressed on. But the line about people not reading laws and celebrating slogans over substance, was that not a direct attack on the very voters you claim to represent? Karoline forced a chuckle, the kind that sounds like a lie you rehearsed but didn't quite believe. "We all speak differently behind closed doors. But I want to make one thing clear. I believe in respectful dialogue. I want to move forward together." The segment ended, but nothing moved forward. After the broadcast, there were no calls of support, no follow-up interviews, only silence, thick and heavy, like fog in a locked room. Her phone vibrated once, a single message from her former strategist: "You should lay low. You're radioactive." The next morning, Politico ran the headline, "Blunt as a Hammer. Leavitt's base cracks. The collapse of a conservative darling." Inside was a brutal quote from an anonymous GOP donor. She wanted a war of words. Jasmine gave her a war of records. Now she's out of ammunition. The comment hit harder than any meme. Across social media, Karoline's posts were met not with fury, but with emptiness. Comments trickled in, not from trolls, but from longtime supporters now saying things like, "I'm disappointed," or worse, "I'm done." By noon, her media booker canceled every planned appearance for the week. No upside, the memo read. Even the right-wing talk shows, once her loudest cheerleaders, had pivoted to new controversies. She wasn't even being mocked anymore. She was being erased. In desperation, she tried one final broadcast. A solo address streamed from her office with an American flag propped behind her like a shield. She sat stiffly in a navy suit, her voice tight but practiced. "I want the country to know that my words were taken out of context. I've always fought for working families, always believed in dialogue, and I will continue to show up, even when it's hard." But the words felt like an echo inside a vacuum. The live viewer count never broke 10,000, a fraction of her former base. Comments flashed on the side of the screen, most of them one word: nope. Too late. Explain voting against it first. What cut deepest wasn't the criticism, it was the disinterest. She'd lit the match herself, and now the smoke was choking her out. Back in her office, Karoline sat alone in the dimming light. Outside her window, DC moved on. Reporters packed up. Emails went unanswered. Her staffers, once eager young idealists, now disappeared one by one. Not in protest, but in quiet retreat. She was losing not in a blaze of scandal, but in a slow, clinical rejection. The kind that doesn't scream, it just leaves. And when she looked in the mirror that evening, she didn't see a fighter. She saw a figure reciting apologies into a void. Her voice hadn't changed, but the country had turned the volume all the way down. While Karoline's voice faded into empty statements and unanswered calls, Jasmine Crockett stood at the edge of a moment that wasn't about power, it was about redemption. It was just past 2 p.m. when the double doors to the House chamber swung open and Jasmine Crockett stepped inside. Her heels echoed against the marble, steady and deliberate, like someone not walking into a fight, but finishing one. Every seat was filled. The press gallery overflowed. The floor buzzed with whispered strategy, restless eyes, silent calculations. But Jasmine, she was silent, still, focused. In the sea of lawmakers, fidgeting with ties, checking notes, and glancing at aides, she stood with her hands at her sides. No phone, no folder, just a small pin over her heart, shaped like a broken house stitched back together. The clerk read the title of the bill aloud. House Resolution 4289, the Crockett Housing Reform Act. No longer a draft, no longer a PDF passed in the early dawn hours. It was now legislation, alive, debated, and standing at the edge of law. The speaker gave the floor to the bill's sponsor, and Jasmine Crockett took a breath, not to calm herself, but to center something deeper. "I stand here not for applause," she began, her voice not raised but unmistakably present. "I stand here because somewhere in this country, right now, a 7-year-old girl is doing homework in the backseat of a car, and she doesn't know who I am. She doesn't care what party I represent. She just knows it's cold, and she wants to sleep without hearing her mom cry again." The chamber didn't move. Some lowered their eyes. Others leaned in. "We're not here today to congratulate each other," she continued. "We're here to do something long overdue. We are not repaying favors. We are repaying a moral debt." A few murmurs rippled, but no one interrupted. She turned, slowly scanning the room. To the veterans we shoved into temporary housing with broken heat, to the grandmothers raising 3 grandkids in motel rooms because no landlord will take their voucher, to the families redlined out of mortgages, then blamed for not owning homes, they were always here. We just chose not to see them. Silence wrapped around the chamber like a steel band. No more edits, no more excuses. This bill is not perfect, but neither is justice when it arrives late. Today we don't owe each other thanks. We owe America's invisible a promise. We see you now. And with that, she stepped back. No grand close, no rallying cry, just a heartbeat's worth of silence before the vote began. The chamber lit up in green and red as members cast their votes, some quickly, some with hesitation, some stood still, staring at the screen like it might blink twice and disappear. The numbers rolled upward: 78, 102, 141. Jasmine didn't watch. She kept her hands folded. Every second passed like a drop of mercury sliding down glass. Inevitable, weighty, irreversible. At 2:36 p.m., the count froze. 229 oui, 204 nay oui. The bill had passed. The sound in the chamber wasn't explosive. It was subdued, reverent, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm when you realize the damage is not just behind you, but finally acknowledged. Aides clapped silently. Reporters bolted from the gallery. Staffers wiped away tears they hadn't meant to show. One congressman whispered to a colleague, "I didn't think it would make it this far." But it had. And Jasmine Crockett had walked it there without screaming once. Outside the chamber, cameras swarmed. Questions flew. One reporter, young, breathless, shoved her mic forward. "Congresswoman Crockett, do you feel like you finally had the last word in this debate?" Jasmine stopped, not because she didn't expect it, but because she knew it was coming. Her eyes met the reporters. No smirk, no shade, just clarity. "I was never here for the last word," she said. "I was here for better words." She turned, walked down the marble steps, and vanished into the crowd, not needing the spotlight to know she'd already changed the direction it pointed. The halls of Congress still echoed with the soundless weight of what had just happened. The Crockett Housing Reform Act hadn't just passed. It had landed like a meteor in the heart of American politics, shifting the ground under every carefully built narrative. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't there to watch the aftershocks. While pundits were still catching their breath and opponents were scrambling for spin, Jasmine was already gone. No press conference, no victory lap, no smug tweet. Instead, she slipped out a side door and walked 3 blocks in the cold, wind tugging at the hem of her coat, toward a forgotten part of D.C., where cable news never bothered to point a camera. She arrived at a low brick building with flickering lights and a buzzer that hadn't worked since the Obama years. A free clinic and housing resource center. The carpet inside was threadbare, the waiting chairs mismatched and scuffed. But the staff stood the moment she walked in, not out of formality, out of disbelief. No member of Congress had ever come through their doors without a press team and a photo op. Jasmine nodded politely, took off her coat, and rolled up her sleeves. "Show me what you're still fighting," she said. There were 12 of them: caseworkers, social workers, 2 shelter directors, a nurse practitioner, and one exhausted woman who ran housing placement for 3 wards with nothing but a phone and a yellowing Excel sheet. They hadn't prepped a slideshow. They weren't ready for questions. But Jasmine didn't ask for that. She asked for their binders, their pain points, their stalled grants, and their broken intake systems. She asked about the families whose names never made the policy memos. She sat at a folding table, no notepad, just listening, leaning in. One caseworker, Jamal, rubbed his temples as he spoke. "We've got 12 kids under 10 living in a shelter that wasn't built for families. No playroom, no quiet space. They cry every night because the men down the hall scream in their sleep." Jasmine didn't flinch. "How long have they been there?" 3 months, some longer. 2 got held back from school because they moved 3 times in a semester." She looked him in the eye. "Put their names on the back of my print copy." Another, Mariella, slid a packet across the table. "These are the forms we use to verify housing need. They haven't been updated in 9 years. The state won't honor digital signatures, so we're printing these out, mailing them to be signed, then scanning them back. It takes weeks. Families get evicted while waiting." Jasmine flipped through the pages, her fingers grazing the handwritten annotations in the margins. She looked up. "This is what they call red tape. I call it a noose." Someone let out a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. The meeting stretched to 90 minutes, then 2 hours. No cameras, no interns bringing coffee, just the rustle of paper, the creak of metal chairs, and the low burn of urgency. Jasmine didn't glance at her watch once. She only asked 2 things. What has no one fixed? And What did you give up trying to fight for? At the end, she stood, gathering the documents they'd handed her. She didn't make promises, didn't toss out hopeful headlines. She simply said, "I'll be back, not to listen, to report." Outside, the street was darker than when she arrived. Fog crept up from the sewer grates. Somewhere in the distance, a siren moaned. But Jasmine didn't rush. She walked slow, like someone carrying more than just paperwork. Like someone who knew the story didn't end with a vote. Because real victory isn't written in ink. It's earned in the places no one films. And that's exactly where she was going next. The sun had already dropped below the rooftops of Gary, Indiana, casting long shadows across cracked sidewalks and shuttered storefronts. Inside apartment 2B of a weathered brick complex that hadn't seen a new coat of paint in over a decade, Thomas Rivers sat in a wooden chair so worn it leaned slightly to the left. The kitchen smelled like boiled coffee and old books. On the small linoleum table lay a folded copy of the Post-Tribune, a chipped coffee mug, and a dusty radio that hadn't worked since 2016. The only light came from the TV screen across the room, casting its cold blue glow across his deep-lined face. Thomas was 73 years old, a Vietnam combat medic, Bronze Star, dishonorably discharged, then honorably restored because they had finally admitted their mistake. 3 grown children, 5 grandkids. 2 of them didn't speak to him anymore. 1 did sometimes. A 4th eviction notice now yellowed and pinned to the fridge with a rusted Veterans of Foreign Wars magnet. He hadn't taken it down, not because he wanted to remember, but because there was no point. But tonight something was different. He reached for the remote with a stiff hand, bones clicking, and raised the volume. C-SPAN was rebroadcasting the final vote from earlier that day. He watched as names lit up in green and red. Yay, nay. The numbers rolled slowly upward, an arithmetic of the powerful, as distant as the moon. But Thomas knew what those votes meant, not from think tanks or op-eds, but from cold nights with no heat, from waiting 5 hours at the VA for a medication that never came, from seeing his neighbor, Miss Lila, freeze to death in her wheelchair 2 winters ago because her Section 8 renewal got lost in the shuffle. And then she appeared, Jasmine Crockett, not shouting, not grandstanding, just standing. Her eyes didn't dart, her voice didn't tremble. She looked like someone who had already walked through the fire and didn't need to remind anyone of the burn. "Today we don't say thank you to each other," she said on screen. "We say I see you to the people we failed to see." Thomas blinked, slow. His hands, rough from years of welding and fixing everything but his own broken luck, trembled a little. That woman, he didn't know her, never met her, didn't vote for her, but she had said something months ago on a live stream that stuck with him. "I don't write bills for cameras. I write them for people who can't afford to wait anymore." He remembered scribbling his name down in shaky pen on one of those petition sheets some volunteer kid had brought to the VA. "If you've been denied housing due to paperwork delay, tell your story." He hadn't told it all, just enough. He didn't think anyone was reading, but somehow she had. He rose slowly, knee joints protesting, and shuffled over to the fridge. The eviction notice stared back at him like it always had. Words printed in bold, indifferent ink. Final notification. Relocation required within 10 days. The manager had said it wasn't personal. Just business. Market's moving up. You understand. He had nodded then, but now he was tired of understanding. He pulled the notice down, grabbed a match from the drawer and struck it against the side of the counter. The flame took hold slowly, licking the corner of the page. He held it over the sink, watched it curl, blacken, turn to ash. There was no celebration, no music, just that quiet crackle of paper burning, and the weight of something lifting off his shoulders. As he watched it burn, he muttered, not in anger, not in pride, but in recognition. Damn right. They see us now. He stayed there for a long moment, watching the ashes settle in the stainless steel basin. Then he turned and walked slowly back to the kitchen table. The chair groaned under him as he sat. He picked up the remote, this time not to mute the noise, but to listen. Crockett was still on screen. She wasn't speaking anymore, just sitting, silent, watching the vote numbers lock into place. Her fingers tapped once on the desk in front of her, a small, unconscious rhythm. like she was counting something older than politics. Thomas recognized it. That's how soldiers look when they're watching a field, waiting for the wind to shift. He exhaled. It had been years, decades, since he believed in a vote. But this one felt different. Not because it fixed everything. It didn't. Not yet. But because for once, someone in power hadn't just seen the charts. They saw him. And now, for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt like he had the right to stay in the room. Not as a statistic, but as a citizen. He looked around the kitchen, the cracked ceiling, the leaning cabinet, the list of medications scotch-taped to the wall. Then he smiled just a little. Not because it was over, but because maybe, just maybe, it had finally started. The studio lights were too hot, but Karoline didn't ask for them to be dimmed. That would have made her look rattled. She sat straight in the high-back leather chair, knees crossed, a folder balanced perfectly across her lap like a shield. Her blazer was the color of resolve, deep crimson, but her knuckles, clutched around the folder's edge, were pale white. Behind her, the LED screen read, "The Crockett bill, too fast, too far." It was supposed to be a safe segment, an interview on a conservative-leaning network. The producer had promised, no ambushes, we'll keep it focused on policy, not the drama. But Karoline had learned the hard way. Nothing was safe when the tides were shifting. And lately, they weren't just shifting. They were rising. The host, polished and practiced, greeted her with a toothy smile. "Congresswoman Leavitt, thank you for joining us." She nodded. "Glad to be here." Her voice was steady, but thinner than usual. They exchanged pleasantries, jobs reports, inflation, border security. Then the host leaned in slightly, index finger tapping his cue card like it was a countdown. "Let's talk housing," he said. "Your name's been tied, rightly or wrongly, to Congresswoman Crockett's proposal. There's a lot of noise out there. Give us your side." Karoline didn't blink. She had practiced this answer 15 times. "I've always believed in practical solutions," she began. "Not slogans, not emotional appeals. Housing is a serious issue. It deserves more than a headline." The host raised a brow. "Are you suggesting her bill is just headlines?" Karoline hesitated, but just for half a second. "I'm suggesting it's reactive. It's not how we do responsible governance." "But the data checks out," he said, more quickly than she expected. "Reuters confirmed the numbers. Even some of your Republican colleagues have expressed quiet support. Isn't this a moment to recalibrate?" There it was. The trap wasn't in the question. It was in the tone. Karoline forced a laugh. "It's easy to write something that sounds good. That plays well on social media. But policy is about sustainability, not just empathy." The host's smile flickered. She passed the bill. Empathy or not, it's policy now. A flicker of irritation crossed Karoline's face. She masked it with a breath. "She played the game well," she said, eyes narrowing slightly. "I'll give her that." The host didn't respond. Instead, the screen behind them shifted to B-roll of Jasmine touring a shelter in Rhode Island. No cameras, no press, just grainy footage caught on someone's phone. Volunteers, folded chairs, Jasmine in sneakers, holding a clipboard. The silence between Karoline's last words and the image was deafening. And then came the real blow. The host leaned in again. "There's also been some chatter about a leaked audio clip. A fundraiser in Charleston. Your voice allegedly saying," he checked the quote card, "these people don't care about substance. Give them a slogan, and they're happy." Karoline's eyes narrowed. That was taken out of context. "Then what's the context?" She blinked. "It was a joke. Off the record. Everyone in the room knew that." "Did you deny saying it?" Silence. A beat passed. Karoline inhaled sharply. "Look, I'm here because I want a productive conversation. I'm tired of the media trying to make this about personalities. I've said repeatedly that I welcome real dialogue." "But no one's answering your call," the host said, his voice softening. "Not in sympathy, but in precision. Your statement last night got almost no coverage. Donors are stepping back. Allies are quiet. Do you feel isolated in this moment?" Her lips tightened. She didn't answer that. Not directly. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her voice lower. tighter. I think the public deserves honesty, and I think we've mistaken charisma for competence. The host nodded slowly. Do you believe Congresswoman Crockett lacks competence? Another beat, and this time Karoline saw it. The invisible line. The point of no return. She pulled back. I believe we disagree on methods. Too late. The screen behind them was already replaying the audio leak. These people don't even read the policies. Give them a slogan and a punchline, pretending they understand Crockett's 10-point housing reform. Karoline flinched, but only slightly. The host didn't press further. He didn't need to. The clip had done the work. The interview wound down with rehearsed talking points. Job creation, economic strength, traditional values. But even as she spoke them, Karoline could feel the air had left the room. The studio was still lit, the microphone still live, but the conversation had moved on. Somewhere else, to someone else. The segment ended. The lights dimmed. Staffers moved quickly to reset for the next guest. Karoline stood, smoothing her skirt, but no one offered eye contact. No one rushed to her side. Her communications director had already left during the second break. In the hallway, her phone buzzed. 3 texts, one from a donor. Let's circle back next quarter. One from a former strategist. You should probably sit things out for a while. And the last from her press aide, now formally resigned. They're not listening anymore. I suggest you do the same. Karoline stood alone outside the green room, heels clicking against tile as she walked slowly to the exit. Behind her, the TV replayed Jasmine's closing line from the house floor. I wasn't here for the last word. I was here for better ones. For the first time, Karoline realized maybe she had said all the wrong ones. And as Jasmine sat there in the quiet hum of her office, the letter folded beside her, something in the silence shifted, not just around her, but inside her. Because this wasn't just about one bill, one vote, or one veteran. It was about every room where power had spoken too loudly and listened too little. It was about every dismissed voice, every brushed aside complaint, every "we'll get back to you" that never came. And in that stillness, the truth pulsed louder than any floor vote. What Jasmine had done was not just legislative. It was deeply, irreversibly human. The lesson was brutal in its simplicity. When systems forget people, people stop believing in systems. For too long, government had become a language only insiders understood. Sterile, coded, self-congratulating. But Jasmine had chosen a different vocabulary. She had written in the voices of the evicted, the uninsured, the underpaid. She had spoken plainly where others spun. And in doing so, she reminded the nation that dignity isn't restored by charisma or clapping. It's restored by listening when no one else will. Jasmine faced mockery, minimization, even contempt. Not for being wrong, but for daring to care out loud in a room built to reward distance. Karoline had tried to reduce her into a soundbite. Twitter tried to bury her under noise. But truth, when backed by lived reality, doesn't need to shout. It just stands, unshaken. Jasmine had done what the loudest critics could not. She had outlasted them by outworking them. She didn't trade fire for fire. She turned every insult into fuel and let the work burn on its own. And perhaps the most haunting truth of all was this: the people who need the most are the ones least likely to ask. Not because they're weak, but because they're tired. Tired of being ignored, blamed, or told that survival is somehow a failure of effort. Jasmine's quiet revolution wasn't just in passing a bill. It was in showing the country what leadership without ego looks like. It was in reminding every Thomas Rivers across America that they were never the problem. Just the proof that the system hadn't been fixed. So when future leaders ask what made this moment matter, let them look not at the applause, the ratings, or even the vote tally. Let them look at the silence that followed. The kind of silence that only arrives when something deeply true has been spoken. That is where the real power lives. Not in who gets the last word, but in who speaks the one that finally lands. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.